maybe there was a lot of life still in front of me, or maybe this road was taking me to an end. I was, as the old folk song says, walking that lonesome valley. Only I was driving and I was in my car and I was southbound on I-35 headed to San Antonio for an early morning appointment. And the news this geneticist had to tell me was literally life or death. I was driving along and the downpour turned into a hard rain. I missed my damn exit. And I thought, oh no, I'm going to be late for this appointment. And I really want to know what he's going to say, obviously, but I also kind of maybe don't want to know. My father and my brother, years later, both died from Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a genetic disease that attacks the central nervous system, and I had never heard of it before my father was diagnosed. It's famously associated with Woody Guthrie, the folk singer, who died from it. The three most important things I learned about Huntington's disease from my perspective when my father was diagnosed and I was a teenager were, one, I now had a 50-50 chance of getting that gene. Two, anybody who gets that gene will get the disease. And three, the disease is always fatal. Symptoms include initially a loss of executive function and emotional regulation, personality changes, and there are a lot of physical symptoms, starting with a twitching of the fingers and toes that eventually becomes rhythmic movements of the arms and legs constantly. The patient can't control it. Eventually, this takes over the torso so that the person is in constant motion, writhing, unable to stand, walk. Swallowing is affected so that eventually someone who is affected with Huntington's disease can't take food or drink by mouth, can't speak. Every time they swallow, it's a risk of choking or aspiration. I saw it with my father and later with my brother. It's a tough, brutal degeneration. And in both their cases, it was about 15 years from diagnosis to the end. So, not a great road to go down. I dreaded it more than anything. One of my fears as a teenager taking in this information was that anything I did would be pointless because it would just be swept away by the ravages of disease, all these things happening too young. Why build relationships? Why make goals? Why set down life's road if it's just going to be swept away? But I came to the realization as a very young man that nihilism is a choice. And I wasn't going to do that. That some people with Huntington's disease get symptoms in their 30s and 40s. That's the common at-risk age. But for a lot of people, it's much later. And why let those good years be ruined by constant dread and anxiety over this thing that couldn't be controlled or predicted? There was no way to know back then. There was no test, just, 50-50. May the force be with you. And I summoned my will, and I stared down that despair like the enemy it was, and I sent it into the smallest corner of my mind behind a brick wall, and I resolved to live my life. That's what I did, and it worked for me for a long time. In young adulthood, in the years since my brother's diagnosis had been confirmed, I had made a pretty satisfying life for myself. I had earned a master's degree. I was a published poet and scholar and essayist. I had been doing a good job as my brother's caretaker for almost 4 years. I was a stay-at-home dad for my kids, Dylan and Cassidy, at that time. I was engaged in just the pursuits of life. I became a very, very good cook and a very, very mediocre guitar player. And I learned to juggle. I mean, not well, but I could kind of do it. Just engaged in living life and trying to meet my responsibilities and be connected with my people. And I was happily married. And my wife understood that I was at risk and was on board with the let's live as if this isn't happening approach to the doom that was hanging over my head, really our heads at that point. But I was moving into a more at-risk age. And what that meant was that the despair and worry that I had bricked up behind that wall, Edgar Allan Poe style, would come busting out every once in a while, and I would find it harder and harder to send it back to its corner, the despair and worry that was always threatening me. And it wasn't just me. Every absent-minded instance, every bit of clumsiness, which I got some, every instance of poor judgment, not just myself, but my wife was starting to really worry, oh, this is Huntington's. This is the onset. These are the early signs. He's gone. And she, without really discussing it with me, emotionally disconnected from our marriage and was kind of watching me as if through a microscope. And we really never were able to reconcile all the ways that manifested, all the distance that came in between us. And we were never close again, and eventually did divorce and go on to separate relationships and a separate life. But at the same time, this at-risk age was making it harder and harder to just live with this threat that I knew was waiting for me or might be waiting for me. Science caught up. The early generation of Huntington's disease tests were not a very good option. They were expensive. They were scattered around the country. There was a high rate of inconclusive results. But the new tests that were coming out right in this time had higher degree of accuracy. I could have it done as close as San Antonio. And there were very few inconclusive results. And I decided to bite the bullet. And now it was going to be real. There's a protocol. Doesn't go fast. I met with a psychiatrist who had to determine that I was stable enough to handle a negative result, a positive result that would be a negative result. People who test positive for Huntington's disease are at huge risk of self-harm. And sure, yeah, I had those kind of thoughts. I did the assessment items, and then had a long conversation with the psychiatrist, at the end of which he certified I am sane, emotionally resilient, and highly stable. I might have bullshitted him just a little bit, but that was the result. So now I met with the geneticists. They drew blood. They sent it off to one of the big labs, and it was a waiting game, which, as Tom Petty will let us know every time, is the hardest part. So 3 weeks, they told me, from the time they took my blood and I jumped through all the hoops to when I should get my results. And in those 3 weeks, that brick wall behind which I had bricked up the despair and worry, oh my God, what if this is what my life is going to be? What if I'm not going to be there for my loved ones? What if I have to endure a decade and a half of steady decline? You know, it was eating at me all the time. It made it really hard as I was trying to do my grading and do my own writing and take care of my kids. And my kids were getting on my damn nerves. I don't mean my own kids. I mean the college students, but my own kids too. And my patience was crumbling. My mood was bad. When the 3 weeks were up and then another day and another day went by, I contacted the geneticist and said, hey man, I'm real curious to know about the results of that test you told me I would have 2 days ago. And he said, sorry, there's a delay at the lab. It'll be another week. That week went by, and another day and another, and then he called me and said, okay, we've got your results. be here first thing in the morning. You have to get them in person. So I headed out, no longer part of an us, part of a me, walking that lonesome valley in my car on I-35. And that's about when I missed that exit. I got turned around and I was only a couple of minutes late. And now it was going to be real. Now it was going to be the answer I had known I could never have, and then maybe didn't want, and now I was going to have it. I saw the doctor come out to meet me. We went walking down a hallway, 30 feet that felt like 30 miles. He opened the door and we stepped inside, and before I could even sit down, he said, "So, Mr. Knight, it's good news."